Thank you, Katy, for being with us. It is great to have you in Washington. It is great to have you at the Hirshhorn. And I know we are with a lot of fans this evening. I count myself among your admirers and appreciators. And certainly when I was working, for the years that I was working to plan the exhibition upstairs, your work, your podcast, your social media presence, these were touchstones for me as I was thinking through what it meant to focus on women's art, on women artists, and to make a project of focusing on the work of art made by women and gender nonconforming artists. So it's a thrill to have you here, and it's a thrill to celebrate this remarkable book, which I'm excited to speak more about in just a moment. So like many admirers, I've heard you speak about this sort of epiphany moment in 2015 at a large London art fair that led to the Great Women Artists podcast, and I want to ask about that in a moment. But first I wanted to ask about a different origin story, which was how you came to be at that art fair in the first place. Was art something that you grew up around as a child? What was the beginning of your love affair?
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you, Melissa, and all of you for coming. This is a total dream to be here, and I visited the Hirshhorn years ago, and to be speaking here is really an honor, so thank you. I've just always been obsessed with art, really since I was a kid. I grew up in London, and I was 6 years old when the Tate Modern opened, the Turbine Hall, which if anyone's visited London, you will know that it is this incredible, vast space that is just kind of overwhelming, but just so exciting. And I remember just being a kid sort of running around there and seeing, Louise Bourgeois' Spider, which was 20 meters or 40 meters high, Anish Kapoor's incredible sort of red installation, which looks like a gramophone, or the way that Rachel White Reed stacked boxes and boxes and boxes up like in this vast space. And I think as a kid, you can't but help just be amazed by it and just in awe of what you're seeing. It's a bit like when you walk into the Barbara Kruger installation or the Kusama installation. They're just overwhelming, visceral feelings, no matter how much art historical knowledge you have. And, I'm not necessarily from an artistic family, but my parents were always very encouraging of museum visits, and I'm from lots of brothers and sisters, and my elder sister always took me to galleries. And so we'd sort of go off on Saturday afternoons, and she'd sort of teach me how to draw, and she lived in Florence, and I remember looking at a Botticelli with her, and, and she, really, when someone you think is so cool and you idolize tells you, or directs you for something, you really just, I don't know, it's that sort of heightened thing.
Yeah, I had a cousin, you had a sister.
Yeah. And the thing is that I just became obsessed. And I remember the first time I ever took the tube, I went to the Chrysophilia exhibition. The first time I took the tube on my own, I went to see the Chrysophilia exhibition at Tate Britain. And art just became this sort of haven for me. And places of museums, they're places of curiosity, and you can just get lost in them. And people say to me, I've been in New York for about 5 weeks now, and I've been to the Met 9 times, which might sound a bit ridiculous, but at the same time, that's not enough. There are just so many more things to see. And also, what's incredible about having this, had this big journey with art my whole life, is actually seeing artworks. When I was a teenager, and now at the age I am now, and actually how that is different. Because the thing is, although an artwork might be a static thing, we change as people, so we're always going to learn something from it. An artwork always teaches us something about ourselves that somehow kind of we can instantly recognize. It's this magic, dynamic thing.
And you did end up studying art as well. And so where was that, and what did you take from that experience?
So I studied art history at A-level. I remember walking into the classroom and thinking, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is a subject. I can take an exam in this, fantastic. Wasn't like that with my other subjects. And then I went on to study it for university, and I stayed in London because I love the sensation of, we're so lucky in cities, especially places like the Hirshhorn and the Smithsonian museums, because they're free. And actually, when places are free, you can just revisit and revisit and revisit. And it's the most important thing. And that's why I'm always adamant that all my resources are always free, because I want anyone with any art historical knowledge or access to be able to get them. But really, I loved studying art history at university. But it was actually, like you say, after university that I had this epiphany moment. Because as someone who loved art so much, I couldn't believe that I hadn't questioned the gender imbalance in art history. And really, firstly, I was just shocked at my own lack of knowledge and just lack of, naivety in a way. And I felt cheated and frustrated. And so I just embarked on this journey where I literally couldn't sleep that night. And I just typed the words women artists into Instagram and nothing appeared. And so I was like, well, you know what? I need to just teach myself. That's really, I still do it, 8 years later for myself, and to practice writing and to look for artists and to celebrate them. And also, the power of Instagram is so powerful. The fact that anyone with an internet connection can access this. But also that was the whole point as well. It was to sort of try and interweave into people's daily feeds. And I think in 2015, it was such an interesting moment because Instagram wasn't really being used for activism so much. But it just had an amazing response. And then I curated an exhibition a couple of years later and in a foyer of an advertising agency. And I think like 1,000 people came to opening night. It was crazy. But it was just like, it felt like there was this like-mindedness, I just play a small part in this, but, in the 8 years that I've been doing my job, we are standing on the shoulders of so many incredible people, but just the amount of, women who we have in powerful positions as directors of museums, it's similar in Europe as well with the Louvre and the Tate, and things are changing. It's a really exciting time.
It's a thrilling time. So talk about that Instagram moment. You've mentioned a little bit about what it offered you as a platform, but it's been incredible to, get those images and that information every day as this sort of shot of good that
I'm so pleased.
But it's been interesting too to see the way with which you choose and select artists and artworks to highlight. Do you have, how do things come to you? How do you make those selection processes?
So people always say, you'll probably have this huge schedule and everything. Everything is decided in the moment.
Really?
I know that might sound completely ridiculous. But the thing is, it's all about, I think, I've tried to plan posts, but the thing is, the magic thing about art is just what you're thinking about that day and sort of what I write a column for The Guardian and I always sort of write it in the moment because that's sort of, you can grab onto it more. And when you look at a work or you see a work or you're Googling a work and you just say, that's what I want to write about today, you kind of have this outpour of just emotion and visceralness and everything. And so really it just comes to, all the artwork that I profile in my book or my Instagram or podcast, it's just art that speaks to me. And, I always say that doesn't have to be the right answer at all. We all have different ideas of what art speaks to us, and that's the magic thing. I'm sure that, if you were to write a story of art without men, that it would be completely different, and I would love to hear that, because I think it's all about us bringing our own experiences to art objects and sharing them. Art museums, but also artworks are places of discussion and debate, and they have been, driving forces for change. Museums is where we have we have the debate to change the world, really. And how incredible that an artist can kind of show us something that we can instantly recognize, but they've been working 400 years ago. And I think what I love about art so much is that it is this individual's impression of what happened in that moment. And they might not even know how it would speak to us, 100, 200, 300 years later, but somehow it does. Like I, think of someone like Artemisia Gentileschi, a fantastic Baroque artist working at the cusp of the 17th century. And she made these extraordinary sort of biblical and mythological scenes of heroines from art history, and sometimes quite bloody and violent.
Gruesome, yes.
But, her spirit is so alive in them. And, I begin the book with an epigraph from her, a quote from 1649, and she says, "I'll show you what a woman can do." And she broke boundaries. I've never met her. We lived in a completely different world, but somehow we connect to her.
Yeah, it all feels incredibly contemporary when you're able to sort of meet it where it's at in that way. It's remarkable to feel in person. It's always lovely to read and hear the sincerity of the enthusiasm, the excitement, and the curiosity that comes through across the various platforms with which you engage. And I think that's palpable and meaningful, and also opens up to people who might have felt as though art could not, that there was no access point, right? We think a lot in the museum about the language that appears on the walls and how we communicate, in what ways we communicate with the visitors who come through the doors. And I'm wondering about if you could speak a little bit about the tone that you use and what you seek with that tone, be it your writing or your interview style.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really think that the work that I do, you can have any art historical knowledge. You could have a PhD in art history, but you could also have never even stepped inside a museum or gallery. And I think that we want to invite as many people into this subject as possible, whether they go on to be artists or curators or writers or filmmakers or anything, because then we get this variety. And it's art history has been written in this very narrow way for a long time. And actually, we're seeing, to put in the Guerrilla Girls, less than half the picture. And actually, the thing is, if we're not seeing art by a wide range of people, then we're just not seeing society as a whole.
Well, that leads us directly into the book, which is a remarkable achievement, and I loved reading it, truly. And I'm excited to talk to you about many different parts of this, but I'm wondering just about the origin story, in fact, of this project. How did a podcast become a book, and what was your research and writing process like?
So, I mean, the podcast also came out of the Instagram, because also what's incredible about Instagram is somehow you sort of know people through their profiles. It's very strange. And I was having the most extraordinary conversations with artists, and there was this trust. I go to their studio. My friend Antonia, I think I was wearing like a silver leather miniskirt or something, and she was like, I was not expecting like a 23-year-old girl to be wearing a silver miniskirt. But it's like, any of us can be art historians, and that's what's so exciting about it. And then because these conversations I just felt were so raw and brilliant, and especially for women or gender non-conforming artists, their story is they've broken so many more boundaries to get to where they were, especially historically. And so I wanted to record them as well, because they're just such fascinating lives. And then, I mean, the book just felt like a sort of natural progression. And the book's title is very much in reference to a book that I read growing up called The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich. And this book is a sort of introductory Bible, a tome. I'm very aware that you guys have Jansen here, which might be your sort of equivalent. And like Jansen, Gombrich failed to include a single woman artist in his first edition, and only the 16th edition included just one, that being Käthe Kollwitz, the great German expressionist. And I remember, I noticed this when I was about 24, because I took over a floor of Tate Modern, and I installed a timeline, a sort of 10-meter high timeline of women artists from the last 1,000 years or something. And I remember looking at Gombrich's for just references, and I was like, well, where are they? Where are they? This is absurd. And then I realized that, he didn't include any. And so that book really, just like he left out women, I left out men. It's as simple as that.
So what was the research and writing process like for you? Because it's a true compendium. It covers 500 years of art making by women artists. So how do you even begin to approach something at that scale?
Well, I mean, the trouble was actually fitting them in, because there are so many. I mean, this is literally a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of art by non-male artists. And what's so great about doing the podcast on Instagram is that I can, keep learning every single day. And, I wrote this book 1.5 years, 2 years ago, and I've always, when I look at it, I see ghosts. I'm like, how can I not include that artist? But we're just constantly learning, which is great. I mean, interestingly, I wrote it during the pandemic. Which was a sort of, a really difficult time for many of us. But what was extraordinary about it is that people, scholars had time. And so the amount of, my gosh, the acknowledgements is about 10 pages long because everyone was so generous. But, I would have these just phone calls for hours with these scholars. I remember talking to Diane Radicke, who's a great scholar in modern impressionist art in New York City, and we would just talk about Paula Modersohn-Becker, and the necklace that she had in one painting was similar to a necklace in a Florian Stettheimer painting. And we were like, do you think they knew each other? Do you think they saw each other? It was like kind of trying to work things out. But I mean, I never, in terms of research, so many different ways. I do the podcast, which provides a well of knowledge, and I have access to all those scholars. It's academic work. It's work that I've seen in museums. It's the internet. There has got to be a correlation between the democratization of art and the rise of the internet, because suddenly we have all these different voices who are partaking in this subject, and that's what makes it so exciting.
Well, I'm hoping we can talk about some of the artists that are represented in the book and why you wanted to highlight their work. And we are a museum of modern and contemporary art, so we will get to that part of the timeline. But I wanted to start in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. I loved reading those parts of the book, and especially, what is striking in going through that compendium and that history is the sense that again and again and again, it is not that women artists did not exist. It is not that no one was there and no one was working. There were women artists who were incredibly successful, who were celebrated. And thus you increasingly have the sense that it was a very active process whereby they were removed from the writing of history. It was not a passive slide. And it really registers in a very, very powerful way in the pages of this book where you spend time on that history. And in particular, this story is quite incredible. I thought you might speak to us for a minute about this artist.
Absolutely. This is Sophonisba Anguissola. And I mean, what's extraordinary? I mean, first of all, the way that art history has been told in the narrative, was it a conscious decision to actually write these narratives out of art history? I'm starting to think it was, which is absurd. And, it's the fact that, women had to work so much harder to just be artists. To be an artist takes a lot. You have to have tools, you have to have training, you have to have a studio, sometimes studio assistants. And really, I mean, these women had to work 100 times harder than their male counterparts. And also they were restricted in so many ways. One of the foremost being the fact that actually they didn't have access to the life room where they could study the nude in the flesh until the 1890s. And so when the academies kind of put these hierarchies in place and said that these grand multi-figured biblical and mythological scenes are seen as, or history paintings are sort of seen at the top, and portraiture and still life or anything to do with decorative arts was at the bottom and dismissed. And actually that immediately just shuts women out of the story whatsoever. But I'm saying, okay, well, if they were restricted to that, what were they doing to sort of upend this? And this is a fantastic example, because the thing is also what I try to do in the book is eliminate these hierarchies between art forms and celebrate tapestry makers, potters, quilt makers, weavers, architects, sculptors working in marble, but also painters and everything. And so in the early chapters, we really look at, a lot of still life and portraiture. And this is by Sophonisba Anguissola, who made it in 1550. Now, it's called Self-Portrait with Bernardino Campi. And when we first look at this work, it looks like him dictating her appearance. But actually, obviously, it's her dictating his appearance. And not only is she painted herself 1.5 times as big as him. Yeah, I love it. She'd love that. Not that I knew her. And then she's got him painting the embellishment of the jacket, which is something normally assigned to an apprentice. But if we look closely, which Pentimento discovered in the 1990s, her hand is guiding his around the canvas. And it's, I literally get chills from it, because it's like, this is 1550. And it's almost as though, I don't know, I wasn't in her mind, but it's almost as though she's saying, I am just as good as you, or I deserve this place. And actually, she's switching up these gender conventions. And it's, speaking to me in 2023 like never before. And I just think, she was totally pioneering. And also, if you're going to be restricted to that, then you've got to think of clever ways to sort of upend these traits. There's a great book, a image that's in the book called The Chess Game by Sophonisba Anguissola, and it's of her sisters and her involved in a very conversational game of chess. And we can see that actually, there's a landscape behind them. And this idea that, okay, well, if I have to, be restricted to portraiture, then I'm going to interweave different levels. And similarly with still life, an extraordinary painter called Clara Peters, working in the early 1600s, a Flemish artist working in still life. What we think is sort of goblets and vases and sort of, platters all spread out delectably on a table. When we look closely at these goblets, actually unveiled are sometimes up to 11 self-portraits. And actually, not only is that to say that I can do this as well, but it's also to sort of determine your place in art history. And this idea of actually making a self-portrait is such a political act. It's demanding your place in art history. And just the fact that these works survive is incredible.
It is incredible. And you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is the work before the restoration, which revealed this sort of added layer of complexity and sort of, yeah. Well, so onto a very different portrait. You've described these wonderful relationships that you have with scholars and other historians that have led you to these incredibly enriching conversations about history. But I wanted to go to, relationships that you have with artists today, because that is also such, it's clear that you have developed incredibly profound and working relationships with so many of the artists that you have interviewed, have written about. And maybe in particular, you can talk about Chantal Jaffe and what it means to become the subject of such a portrait as opposed to the historian who is looking at it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, you know, my job is kind of an excuse to meet my heroes. I always think you may as well, and everyone's great, so it's wonderful. And I mean, Chantal, you know, I worked at a gallery for 10 years in London called Victoria Miro, and I worked on front desk and then joined the comms teams and then was on the exhibition teams and did all sorts of different various roles. And Chantal was an artist there. And I couldn't believe that one day we were chatting because she was involved in this collage show, and we were talking about Mary Delaney, who's in the book, who's a collage artist in the 1700s. And she said, you know, come over, do you want to come over and be painted? And I just, oh my God, like, this is amazing. And actually what's really funny is that she's now been painting me for four to 5 years. And this was on my 29th birthday a few months ago, hence the birthday portrait. And the first one was the day before my 25th birthday. And I look so excited. It's hilarious. My eyes are kind of bouncing off the canvas. But, you know, actually what's really been amazing is from that time, you know, 2018 to 2023, or 2019 to 2023, sorry, you know, we've really developed an amazing friendship. And she's, my God, she's just, you know, one of the most incredible, sensitive painters and people ever. But I mean, you know, I feel like a total fraud being painted by her in the sense that, you know, I literally just kind of come in and sit there and chat to her for hours and have a cup of tea and eat lots of biscuits. Whereas she's sort of working hard on this painting, because it's such a funny, I don't know if anyone else has experienced being sitting for an artist, but in a way it's especially a painter, you're not self-conscious because you can't really, they're capturing an encounter, they're capturing a mood, and it's also as much of a self-portrait of theirs as it is a portrait of you. And I think that's so special as well. And, you know, me and Chantal, we always talk about someone like Alice Neel. And Alice Neel is one of my absolute favourite painters in the world. For those who don't know her, she was an American portrait painter who lived from 1900 to 1984, really sort of spanned the entire 20th century. She was born in Pennsylvania, but she lived most of her life from the early 1930s in New York City, first Greenwich Village, then Harlem, then the Upper West Side. And she painted portraits of the people who lived and shaped New York City. You know, she painted the likes of Andy Warhol or the playwright Alice Walker, but she also painted her landlord's son Benjamin. She painted the taxi driver. She painted her daughter-in-law pregnant. She painted herself, aged 80, nude. You know, it just she painted everyone. But you know, when you look at her portraits, you're not thinking about, God, do they look nice? Do they look, you know, I mean, that looks like me to an extent, but then a painting that she made the next week looks entirely different. And so there is this kind of freedom with it. And actually, it's about capturing that conversation. And someone who writes so beautifully about being painted by Chantal is a writer called Olivia Lang. And I'd urge you all to look up her work. All of her books are fantastic. And, you know, she talks about, you know, this idea of Chantal capturing a mood or an atmosphere, like in the sort of second of a moment. And I think it's about that. It's like, you know, when I was talking earlier about writing about or speaking about art in the moment, sometimes that can actually be the most powerful. You know, one thing I love doing, please, I'm sure lots of you do it yourself, but I would really recommend it, is to literally, when you're in front of an artwork, just download what you think on your notes, because some of those visceral experiences you'll never ever be able to remember. And so I think that like automatic stream of consciousness is so exciting. And I think that's what painters have as well. It's so present. That's the artwork. And that was me on my 29th birthday. It was such fun.
It's amazing. It's an amazing portrait. And it does strike me in listening to you that that experience of becoming a subject does offer you something in the way that you approach looking at portraiture and at sort of making in new ways. And that's a dialogue that's continually sort of enriching and growing is pretty incredible.
I think you notice that it's a portrait of a time. It's not necessarily the person. And I think, so from January to March, every single Sunday I went to Chantal's studio this year because I've been living in New York. So we sort of in the build up to that, and every Sunday brought like new stories, all sorts of drama, but that's what's amazing about it, is that it's this record of a time, and also she's such, like I said, such a sensitive painter. She looks at people. She's not afraid to capture their vulnerabilities, and that's quite difficult as well. Because I always sort of, I'm wearing my birthday suit, and I want to sort of look like a cool writer, but she knows what's going on underneath.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to sort of be a mood shaper as a portraitist, and that way you have to be able to create that space where someone can show you themselves.
Yeah. And I think that's what, she recently wrote about Alice Neil's Andy Warhol portrait, and it's in the book, so do look it up. And, when we think of Andy Warhol, we think of this artist who, just essentially made the commercial Americanized image, like the sort of perfect woman, or, sensationalized that. And it's the opposite of how Alice Neil has captured him. She's captured him right after his attempted assassination by Valerie Solanas. And he's topless, and he's exposed with a scar, and he's got his eyes shut. And if you look closely, I saw this painting recently, it's hardly even, I think it's in the collection of the Whitney or the National Gallery, I can't remember. And even just like the sofa's barely there. And it's almost as though because he's fading into the canvas, because, and just to reveal, I can't believe he let her paint that.
It is, yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, there is a vulnerability to that image, which, again, it sort of becomes, the immediacy of it transcends that distance from the moment that it was painted. It does capture that instant.
Yeah, and Chantal said, it's not a cruel painting. He's just letting her see his vulnerabilities.
I love that. It's lovely. Well, let's look at the next portraitist, who is another artist with whom I believe you have curated exhibitions, you have worked. This is the one, the only Deborah Roberts, and this is the painting that we're looking at that opens the exhibition upstairs. Deborah is, of course, living. She lives and works in Texas. This is a work that came into the collection several years ago, and was, I hoped a way to open the exhibition as an offering, but also as a request to stand up straight and think about these stories and these narratives as they've been told, and then again, what may have been left out. So maybe you can talk to us about your relationship with Deborah and why you wanted to highlight her work in the book.
I mean, Deborah's just a sensation. She's amazing, and she works in collage. And, I think that this idea of the representation of different stories, especially stories of young people, is so important. Also, so we all see each other, we see ourselves in museums and galleries. I remember there's a quote in the book by Micheline Thomas, who's an American painter working in New York City, also works with collage actually. And she says, portraits are really powerful. They have great presence in the world. And actually, Micheline Thomas, when she was young, she was training in law, and actually after seeing Carrie Mae Weems's Kitchen Table series, felt like she could be part of this conversation because she saw her painting, and she saw herself represented and reflected in art. And it's so important to put that as the first image, because that kid who might have just run into this gallery with their parents, who might be seeing the Space Museum next door, but they come in here and they see, oh, actually, that's my story too. And the way that she charges that with power. And so Deborah has become a great friend of mine, and she's just such fun. And but her work is so important, and it's unlike anything. And also using the power of collage. What does collage mean? It can actually evoke the sort of multitudinousness of our personalities. The fact that we are so many different people. The fact that we can, instill James Baldwin's eyes and Michelle Obama's hands within this portrait of a young black child. It's incredible. And also to focus on what it means to be a young person today. It's a really emotional, serious thing. And she is not afraid to address that. And she's incredible with that. And last summer, we curated an exhibition in London. Oh my gosh, I've forgotten the collage. I can't remember the name, that's terrible. And anyway, at Stephen Friedman Gallery. And From Near or Far, that's the one. Sorry, I haven't thought about it for ages. And we put together all these contemporary women artists like Micheline Thomas, Amy Sherald, her work as well, and Rothenstein. And what was amazing about that show was a sort of collectiveness of what collage means today. And actually that can mean so many different things. I mean, so for example, historically, we thought about the likes of Hannah Hoch, who was an extraordinary German artist working just after the First World War, and to almost sort of comprehend the tumultuous era of what Germany was in the early 1920s, she took to collage because it was almost as though no other medium was sort of comprehensible. And then we looked at the likes of Pauline Boty, who was a painter in the British pop art movement, who painted the 60s in collage. You know, so what she would do is she would have, and it's in the book, she would paint these pictures called It's a Man's World 1 or It's a Man's World 2. And it would be, you know, Elvis, Marilyn, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, because this was the era of commercialization and the era that suddenly, you know, billboards, advertising, you know, Americanization, sort of the proliferation of images and information coming at us at a rapid speed. And then we think about 2023 and what world are we in today? And collage can mean so many different things in the sense that, you know, the way we look at our phones or our screens, everything is like a collage the whole time because it's constantly evolving. And so to put that into sort of a still image as well. I remember we had this gorgeous picture by Micheline Thomas and she, you know, bejeweled it. And it was just, it felt like a sort of regal work or something. It was just amazing. But also Amy Sherald, who's famously a painter. You know, what is actually the idea of collage? And so we just wanted to experiment with that in a way.
Oh, it sounds incredible. Was there a book for that show?
There wasn't, but we've got lots of images online.
Okay, good to know. We can all look into it. There are, in fact, many artists whose work is upstairs on view in the exhibition, who are also represented in the book. We have Cecily Brown, who I know you have interviewed and whose show you have seen. I think you said 5 times now at the Met, and you know works from the span of the collection, which is about a century's worth of art. Now about 125 years worth of art making, which again is a lot of work to fit into a narrative. And that question of how do you meet each artist where they're at, right, in that sort of time span and in whatever medium. I wanted to, you know, I was thinking a lot in putting the show together about artists like Joan Mitchell, about Louise Nevelson, Eva Hesse, you know, incredible, now iconic post-war artists, all of whom are included in the exhibition upstairs, but also all of whom were really on the record as never wanting their work to be seen as work that was made by a woman artist, or never necessarily wanting their work to be shown in that way, which is something that I carried and really thought about and a lot when putting together and organizing the show. And you know, I wondered in reaching out to many of the artists whose work is on view, whether any of them would not be comfortable with this kind of framing. And of course, again, the desire is to meet each artist where they are, where they want to be met. You address this in the book, in the introduction that you make to that chapter. And you discuss that era, and you talk about sort of the idea that some of these artists would deplore being thought of as women artists, but that for you now, this has become a term of empowerment. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and the generational moment that you think we are in that has opened up new pathways for this kind of engagement and approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think we live in such a different and exciting time. And, you know, there's a great quote by Georgia O'Keeffe. She says, you know, men put me down as the best woman painter. I think I am the best painter. And that is so true. You know, I'm being a total hypocrite here, but yeah. I do not agree that women should be seen as women artists. You know, if we're going to call them women artists, then we'll call them men artists or whoever, you know, anything. And I think because the word woman was maybe, well, yes, a derogatory thing. And actually that is the opposite of what it should be. We should celebrate anyone of any gender and include every story, no matter what background, sexuality, race, or anything that people, you know, have. And I think obviously just to celebrate them as artists first and foremost. But really with the book, what I wanted to do was really challenge, I guess, the narrative of how art has been written. And actually so much of the time, even this idea of sort of contextualizing women artists. And when I would read about an artist or go to an exhibition and read a sort of 50-word bio that was the wall text next to it, the amount of times people would actually root women artists in actually root them in their male contemporaries. So if I remember there was a headline when it was the Lee Krasner exhibition at the Barbican, didn't even mention her name, It says, Jackson Pollock's wife gets exhibition. And it was just like,
How lucky for her.
I mean, you know, she survived, she outlived him by about 30 years or something. And it's just the fact that, you know, I mean, sorry, I'm talking about lots of things at once, but it's just that kind of thing. And then also just, I was so fed up of artists being seen as the wife or the muse of, or the sister of, or the daughter of, and actually to sort of root them in their political and social history and sort of have that as a sort of conduit to sort of latch onto is so important.
It seems you were very conscientious about that within the writing of this book. There are certain moments where certain male names are definitively not mentioned, and it's great. But in listening to you talk about this too, I'm sort of coming back to this moment that I loved towards the end of the book, and I'm gonna go ahead and quote. You say, I cannot express enough that just because they, meaning women artists, are being discussed right now, this does not mean that they should be seen as a trend. Overlooked artists are not a trend. Women artists are not a trend. Queer artists are not a trend. Artists of color are not a trend. Art historians and those engaged in creating the canons of art must sustain their stories. And in order to do that, so future generations can see equality as normality and representation as priority, we must create useful, deeply engaging, thoughtful, accessible resources and institutions that reflect the new world. I think, and I would hope that you know, our generation of museum stewards takes on that task and puts it at the forefront of our work. But I'm wondering how you see this moment. Where are we? Where do we need to go? What has changed? What hasn't changed? And what are the mechanisms whereby you think this kind of work can continue to expand and grow and strengthen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an interesting question because, you know, where are we now? We are in this such exciting moment where it's almost as though we've exploded open the canon, or whatever that even means. I mean, you know, I wrote this book in a linear way because it was very much based on Gombrich's story of art, but also very much make clear in the introduction that so many of these artists, this is just a fraction of their career. So many artworks right this second as we're talking are being made that will be in future volumes. And the fact that so many of these artists have ongoing careers, and movements are not the products of artists. Sorry, artists are not the products of movements, but rather movements are the products of artists. And really, I mean, a few artists such as Faith Ringgold and Lee Miller and Annie Albers and Tracy Emin do span different chapters. But really, I mean, you know, my last thing is that I want to box people up in any sort of way. But I mean, in terms of where we are, it's about creating a legacy. And I think that, you know, I mentioned earlier, more people behind the scenes of different backgrounds is just as important as the artists represented on the gallery walls. Because actually, what story are we telling? We need to tell an inclusive story. And it's all about securing the legacy. And so how do you do that? It's collection building. You know, it's all very well us having these touring exhibitions of a woman artist work, but actually, you know, for example, with that, in 2020, the National Gallery of Art in London, 1% of its collection, by the way, is made up of women artists. They had their first ever exhibition of a historic woman artist, Artemisia Gentileschi, in 2020. Yes, they collected one work, which is progress, for sure, and I think we should always count that nothing happens overnight. Ever the optimist. But also, where are those works now? It's like, I want to go to the National Gallery and see myself reflected in this. And so, you know, this amazing curator, Letizia Trevers, who, you know, she worked so hard to get that one work acquired. And actually, it's about saying, okay, how do we want people in 10, 20, 30, 100 years' time to view art history? Are we really going to stay the same? Are we really going to stay on the same path? I think more has exploded in the last 10 years, 5 years, than in the last 50 years. And I see that as, you know, even just the fact that all of you are here tonight and you're interested in this subject is just, you know, a feat in itself, because it's about having these conversations that spark an interest and, you know, might lead you to actually go off and discover an artist who we've all never heard of, or, you know, work with an artist or champion their story. And, you know, like you said, it's so important that these resources are considered, because, you know, the amount of people who say to me, gosh, like, right place, right time, do you want to just curate an exhibition of women artists? And I say, Oh my gosh, that is the opposite. Because also we have a duty to do a service to all these people who came before us, whose stories were overlooked. And our service is to do them, put them in places that are considerate, meaningful, and exciting.
Well, I know that there are going to be many, many questions for you, so I want to make sure that we leave time for that. And while you are readying for questions, I will just ask you one final question, which is about one of the ways that you are doing this work to support this future, and that is by having created an artist residency. I was wondering if you could speak to us about how that started and more about where it transpires and what the shape of it is.
Yeah, oh my gosh, of course. So every year, I've done it for about 4 years now, I run an artist residency called the Great Women Artists Residency at Palazzo Monti, which is this amazing sort of 17th century palazzo in Brescia in northern Italy. It's quite ridiculous. And I send out 3 or 4 artists for 6 weeks at a time, and they're often just, people who I know from London or friends of mine or something. But it's about, it's just such a privilege to be able to do that, firstly. But also it's about creating communities. Being an artist is a really lonely profession, and we need each other to help build each other. And actually, no one does anything on their own. Collaboration is the best thing possible, and to work collectively is how we're going to change the story and how we're going to change the world. And especially where I live in London, rents are so high for studios. And so artists are also, often their studios are outside of London, and even though they might live in London, it's difficult. It's not like before when, people might have had a giant warehouse with so many artists. And so it's about also creating that community where they can ask each other, what did you think of this gallery? Or did this person approach me? Or how should I take my work in this route? And as a result, every year they all become best friends, which is so lovely. The always criteria is that you're a lovely person and then you're a great artist.
Do we have questions? Right in the front row?
First of all, thank you for coming here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And I can't wait to read your book. And I love your passion. And I'm just wondering, you connect to artists so much. So how did you, if you started back in the 1700s, the 1600s, and you work with these academics, these scholars, how did you select? What moved you? And how did you make your selection of the small amount of artists you say are in your book?
That's a great question. It's just whatever moves me. I've interviewed scholars on artists from this period, and I think, like I said earlier, this is really my version of the story of art, and yours would be different, and that's so exciting. But what I was also so conscious of as well is to show the breadth of art that was being made. So I do look at the likes of Artemisia Gentileschi, who made these sort of grand works. I do look at the likes of Plautin and Nelli, who made this extraordinary depiction of the Last Supper that was hidden from view for 450 years, but now hangs in the refectory of the Santa Maria Novella. But also look at the likes of, Mary Delaney, who was working in paper collage, looking at Harriet Powers, who was working in quilt making. There are so many different stories to tell, and I think I'm moved by all of it, really. But definitely finding out information about that section was much harder than part 2 to 5. And part 1 is actually, although it spans from 1500 to 1900, it's by far the slimmest section in the book. And I was so grateful to scholars such as Mary Garrard, who's worked with Artemisia Gentileschi, or the likes of Babette Bon, who's a specialist in 17th century Bolognese, a women artist from Bologna. And that was incredible. But then I also have to say to myself, how many tomes have been written on Michelangelo alone? Yet, why are we putting like Lavinia Fontana and Elisabetta Serrani always in the sort of same books? For any budding art historians in the room, there is so much exciting work to be done, especially in those times. But I think it's extraordinary being a woman in 2023 and looking at these works and reacting to them, even though they were made from a completely different world.
Hi, great to see you here. Love your enthusiasm. As someone who studied art history in the late 80s, early 90s, there was Linda Nochlund's Why Are There No Great Women Artists? And then there was the Guerrilla Girls. And then, there were women making art, and we didn't hear as much now. What role do you think that the internet and social media bringing more people from outside academia and the museum world has helped, people who are not white men gain traction in art and art history.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to say I love your T-shirt. Yeah, that's amazing. It says Cassett, Ringgold, Leicester, Bourgeois, Tanning. Excellent. Well, they're all in the book, so you'll love it. And, I really do think that there is a correlation between the internet and the democratization of art. I think it's such an interesting topic to explore, and I'd love to explore it and discuss it and write about it one day. And, we are all standing on the shoulders. The fact that this talk is happening, or this book is being made, is thanks to all of those scholars, and I am greatly indebted to them, and they are extraordinary, and especially, the likes of the Guerrilla Girls in the 1980s when, Baselitz and whoever were achieving insane prices for their painting, and women artists weren't getting a look in at all in the market, let alone in the museums. And so what they did is that they took to the streets because they were free, and actually they revolutionized art for all of us. And the Guerrilla Girls, they're so timeless in a way because their statistics, first of all, they just state the truth. They say, the disadvantages of being a woman artist, or actually, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Because there are more nude portraits on view than there are work by women. And that translates to, my sort of internet brain so much, and we are so lucky to have them. And for as long as I'm going to be alive, I'm going to be championing this subject. And I just think the internet is it's a very strange resource, but it was also amazing because it can link so many of us together, and we can have these global conversations. Some of you might have listened to the podcast and we've never even met. We'll meet later, but it's like that, how amazing that I can have this conversation with people who we haven't even met yet. And, also with the podcast, I do it and I edit and produce it myself. And so really, it just requires a sort of SoundCloud account and a microphone. And that's the kind of beauty of the internet, is that you can broadcast things on a global scale. And also there is no hierarchy in terms of Instagram because, no one should care about how many followers people have. But I remember meeting Frances Morris, who's the director of Tate Modern, on a plane once at JFK Airport, and I couldn't believe it. And so I DM'd her that day saying, really great to meet you. This is my Instagram. And I could do that. I would never have Frances Morris's email. And then a few weeks later, I was interviewing her on my podcast about Agnes Martin. And it's this really exciting invitation, I think.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was very lucky. I was sent a copy of your book a few weeks ago, so I've read it all, and it's totally changed me. I'm now looking at every canvas everywhere and saying, did his wife really paint this painting, or was it his daughter? And that's why my question to you, with your detective hat on, one of the revelations in your book is that you say that Hokusai had a daughter who was a wonderful painter, and that people are still wondering whether she actually finished a number of his later paintings. And so my question, tell us a couple of the great detective stories, revelations that you suddenly found, like that one, which I'd never heard before, as you were doing the research for this book. Because you've come out with incredible stories in this book, which everybody should buy. But thank you.
My gosh, where to begin? Misattribution and Scandal should be a book in itself. So Hokusai had this extraordinary daughter called Katsushika Oi, who worked in his studio. And also that's how women, very much in pre-1900, were able to become artists, because oftentimes they grew up in their father's studio. There are many cases where Artemisia Gentileschi's work was wrongly attributed to her father. One of my favorite stories in the book, though, is a portrait by Marie Denis Villiers, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because they originally bought it in 1917 for $200,000 when they thought it was by Jacques-Louis David. And so it's this idea of, what value are we placing on genders in society? It's almost as though the art market acts as a microcosm for that. Still today in 2023, women artists go for just 10% on average of a male artist. This is one of the reasons why maybe Clara Peters put self-portraits into her still life to almost demand her place in art history. I mean, especially in the cusp of the 20th century, a court case found that so many works by Frans Hals were actually by Judith Leyster. There's there's an ongoing debate about Duchamp's The Fountain, Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhofen, who supposedly gave him the idea and was making ready-made sculptures before him. And also she made these things called ready-made poems as well. I mean, she was a performance artist, this artist who was working in the 1910s. And, but she died penniless and unknown. And that's criminal. And so I'm so pleased that, you're acknowledging that.
Hi, I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm a big fan. I was really interested to hear you talk about your experiences as a young person going to the Tate and looking around. And I have 2 young kids, both of whom are very enthusiastic about art. And earlier today, my 7-year-old was reading a book of art for kids. And there were 2 female artists. It was like basically a canon for kids. And it's kind of interesting as you talk about this moment that we've just arrived at, where we're all talking about this, we're all thinking about this. I'm like, where are the resources so that this young generation can grow up with this as their starting point? And so I'm wondering partly if you're thinking about that, if, who's giving this talk to elementary school students? You know what I mean?
Maybe I will be next year. But please, anyone else, be encouraged. I think it's about, the best thing we can possibly do is instilling the younger generations in these things, because they're the future, and I think they are so incredible and conscientious about, gender and value and representation in society. And I'm appalled that there are still books in 2023 that mansplain the canon, essentially. I think that, with this book, it's very much sort of written for, I guess like a sort of 12-year-old, maybe the youngest person. It's really designed for like a 12-year-old to a 92-year-old. And also to sort of write in that accessible way, that I want to get as many people of, ages as well as our historical knowledge in. In terms of resources for kids, Tate Kids, I'm not so familiar with American museums just because I don't live here. But the Tate Kids do extraordinary sort of workshops and online resources. And actually, sometimes I find myself reading them because they are so entertaining and, they say things in a very matter-of-fact way. But I do agree that, education needs to start, well, first of all, those in positions of power need to use their platform and make a change, which I think they're absolutely doing, by Melissa inviting me here. And but also we have to instill the next generation, and it's our duty to change the way they see the world.
I also encourage you to, upstairs we piloted for the first time as part of this exhibition on the 3rd floor kids labels for many of the artworks in the show, and there is a kids guide specifically with biographical portraits and information about many of the artists whose work is on view, and it's been probably the thing that I've heard most since the show has opened is enthusiasm about the kids' labels and how much people are responding to that. And it feels incredibly, I certainly have to tip our hats only to our wonderful education team here at the museum, but it's incredibly gratifying to see so many children walking through the museum, let alone the exhibition, and to be able to, devote time and resources to building out that information so that we can reach children early. Yeah.
So it's funny you said Gombrich's book was a Bible, because I think your book is the Bible for 2023 going forward. Two questions. I want to ask you first the question that you conclude all of your podcasts with, so it has to be asked. What is the woman artist? You could say like kind of lately, it doesn't have to be of all time, but who is the woman artist, either deceased or alive, who you haven't met yet, who you would most like to sit down with and talk to?
Artemisia Gentileschi. What was going through my mind? It's amazing. I probably would run away immediately and she'd think I would be terrible. And she'd be like, oh my God, this girl needs to get over herself. But I would just love to know, like, the strength that woman had in the 1600s to produce what she did and to do so much of it on her own as well, and to fight for those stories to be in the canon. I mean, I'd just love to sit down with her and maybe do a podcast episode with her.
And this, just a brief second question. You talked about this briefly, but I would love to hear more about art, like up-and-coming art historians like myself.
What's your name?
Ariana. Yeah.
Oriana.
Okay. You heard it here first. Kidding. So what are some things that you want to kind of pass the torch on, or us to carry the torch? What are kind of things that you're thinking about for the next generation to write about?
I mean, first of all, I think we should just be, I mean, I always think my approach is to invite as many people into this subject as possible and to sort of never discriminate in terms of age or background or level of knowledge or anything. And I think that to get as many people into this subject, that's the goal. Use whatever resource you have around you. I think, I mean, I started on Instagram and it led to a book. And you never know what's going to happen, and nothing ever happens overnight. But use what you've got around you. If you're at university, perhaps you could put on an exhibition of the kids in the art school or something, or engage with the artists of your generation as well. I have so many friends who I've worked with countless times in exhibitions, and now they're doing really exciting work, and they're being profiled in ways that was sort of unimaginable a few years ago. And I think, but then again, I also have friends who are in their 70s, artist friends of mine, and I work with them. And I think, if you are an art historian, not only do you have to spend time in museums, but go out and meet artists as well. Talk to them about what they're thinking. I mean, I've discovered my favorite artists through artists always, whether that be, living or as in like their interests being living or dead. But, I think have as many conversations as many people as possible. Bring people to museums who have never even stepped inside a museum before. That's always my favorite thing. I brought my friend who's a filmmaker to the Alice Neal the other day, and he saw things that I just would never have done. And actually, it's about having those different perspectives and always keeping an open mind.
It's on. Oh, it's on. Congratulations on your volume and what it's contributing for women in the arts, dead and alive. I wonder, what do you think, what kind of responsibilities do museums have? And what do you think of this movement of deaccessioning that's going on in order to diversify collections and bring artists to light who have been ignored up until now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think institutions have a huge responsibility. Even as an art historian, I go to museums to learn. And what I see on the walls is what I think is art history. Because it's basically, you're presenting who the artists are. And I think the Hirshhorn do that very well, I have to say. And so I think they have a responsibility to have so many different components, whether it would be sort of education programs as well, and inviting people into this space. But I don't believe in censorship at all. I don't believe in cancelling anything, even though my book is called The Story of Art That meant. But it's actually, it's about adding to the canon. It's saying, okay, well, this is what we've got now. We need to work with it. And it's a bit like, the National Gallery in London. If 1% of the artists are women, then bring them out of the storage, put them all in the main room to show that they existed. And while you're doing that, work very conscientiously about what works you are acquiring, what narratives you are also telling. I mean, historical museums also, I think, have a responsibility to talk about what works we're actually looking at in terms of subjects as well. I recently wrote about this for The Guardian, this idea of, I looked at the likes of Susanna and the Elders, which is a biblical story from the book of Daniel that basically follows a story of a young girl who was bathing in her garden when two lecherous abusers try and seduce her. And Artemisia Gentileschi portrayed the most extraordinary version because you felt the sort of tension and anguish from the woman. Whereas many male artists' representations almost sexualized her, sort of glorified that. So it's kind of, what narratives are we telling about these paintings? Are we saying this is a beautiful object? Or are we saying, let's actually look at this and talk about this? Because I think we're shying away from what many stories of what we're looking at in art galleries as well, which I think is another layer to the issue of representation of artists as well.
I think as we're sitting in a museum, that call to arms is a wonderful place to end. Hopefully we can all take that inspiration and that energy out into our evenings and into our work, those of us who are doing this work. Please join me in thanking Katy for her time and for joining us.